maybe I'm the only one, but I'm on my second cup and I need more. This has been a very wonderfully produced event, and I want to highlight Farah Abbasi's work. If we could give her another round of applause, please. So I have a clicker here, thankfully, for my slides here. So I think I've been given about 20 minutes to talk, which feels like a lifetime. And that's great, because last time I had about 5 minutes to do this presentation. So this is sort of a presentation about the way in which we can help using some concepts from social psychology, as well as from neuroscience, but particularly from social science, to help replace stereotypes towards Muslims. So I have a lot of content to go over. I'll make this slide available to anyone that would like it afterwards. I know we have a lot of practitioners in social work here, a lot of psychologists, but a lot of activists. And really what this presentation comes from is a debate. So it's a debate that I have with my friends. So I've been, for the last 5 years, heavily engaged with activism and education of the Middle East and of Islam here in America. And I've really broken it down with my friends into two kind of approaches. The first approach I would characterize as a civil rights approach. What I mean by this is, like, Muslims have freedom of religion crises all over the place. We now have 5 states where Sharia is seeking to be banned. We have, of course, the freedom of religion issues at the Ground Zero Mosque, and we have rising hate crimes and rising prejudice. So often my Muslim friends will say, you know, this sounds a lot like what African Americans went through during the Civil Rights Movement. We are largely socioeconomically enfranchised, but our political representation is quite low. So there's a civil rights approach. The second approach I would characterize as what I call cultural approach. And this is the approach that I want to focus on today. Because particularly in the realm of stereotypes, what we know is that stereotypes are actually quite malleable. They are quite able to change quite easily. And there are some conditions by which stereotypes can change. I would argue that the primary way that stereotypes can change is actually through gaining greater cultural capital. So we all know the concept of social capital. Cultural capital is the way in which Muslims become represented amongst their co-religionists and particularly amongst mainstream society. So before we go there, we need to understand, where does Islamophobia come from? So for this, I have a little pop quiz, and I wanted to sort of gain your thoughts on this particular question. This is from the Gallup polling organization. So of the question and the choices, would anybody be brave enough to throw out an idea as to the answer? The question is, the strongest predictor among Americans who harbor prejudice towards Muslims is A, Republican affiliation, prejudice towards Jews, being an evangelical, frequent religious attendance, or being over the age of 30. So I hear A, I hear B. So what may surprise you is the answer is B. Now what does this tell us? This tells me something very interesting, which is that we're not necessarily dealing with a conspiracy. We're not necessarily dealing with political interest groups. We're not necessarily dealing with the Tea Party. We're not dealing with a cottage industry of Islamophobes, although we do have that now, a group of pseudo-experts and some experts who actually have a mission to defame American Muslims. We see this with the manufactured Ground Zero Mosque controversy, which really came from a couple of bloggers online. And this is not my theory, this is actually proven by 60 Minutes when they interviewed Pamela Geller. What this indicates, though, is that actually the problem with Islamophobia is a problem of education. It's a problem of information about Islam in the public, in the mainstream sphere. Because if people actually have prejudice towards Jews and Muslims, and that's the single factor that unites Islamophobia, it's really a fear of foreigners. It's really a fear of xenophobia. It's a fear of otherness. It's a fear of difference. And we see this in the popular media. This political characterization presents a figure who's loosely based on Yasser Arafat. And I find this very telling because it really represents, as John Esposito says, a battle of who gets to speak for Islam. Here we have a secular political figure, Arafat, who is able to actually speak as a symbolic representation of all of Islam, as if there were one static, monolithic Islam. And as he says, Islam is a tolerant religion. We tolerate fanatics, bombers, terrorists, and women, mostly. So this is the way that I think Islam is actually understood, unfortunately, in the mainstream public. So And this is also actually backed up from public opinion about Muslim Americans. Now, the following set of statistics actually present a very interesting and a very kind of contradictory set of positions. So for starters, 63% of Americans say they don't know anything or very little about Islam. Yet 45% still know enough to characterize Islam as a violent religion. 53% of Americans have an unfavorable impression of Islam. 39% would not want a Muslim as their neighbor. But most importantly, which I bolded, is that of the people that actually know a Muslim personally, for which there's actually only 40% of Americans know a Muslim personally, their likeliness of actually having a more favorable impression towards the religion is much, much higher. So what this presents are some very optimistic signs, I think. So, but that being said, we should understand and we should also be willing to deconstruct the term Islamophobia itself. The reason I say that is because would we want to characterize someone like, say, Katie Couric, who recently held a very interesting panel discussion on her show where she brought some American Muslims to talk about Islam and the state of fear and the Ground Zero controversy. And she was still asking questions such as, is Allah a moon god? Or is Muhammad the same thing as Jesus? So these sort of very elementary questions which for Muslim Americans and for people involved, since 9/11, these questions always recycle, they always come up. But would we call her victim of a phobia? Or would we just say that she actually is a curious, concerned citizen like many others? So it's not so much a phobia. Now this is actually backed up by social psychology and research. I want to highlight a book that was written in 1954 by Gregory Alport called The Nature of Prejudice. So it's a very fascinating work. And I just want to highlight 3 or 4 key issues. So for starters, Alport was looking at the way in which African Americans during the Civil Rights era were feeling disenfranchised and were facing extreme sort of social isolation. And instead of looking at the way that prejudice happened towards African Americans as an issue of deep, ingrained hostility towards African Americans, he actually argued that, no, what we should do is take away that idea of understanding the other in forming our estimation of how prejudice works and put it onto the person that's actually deploying the stereotype. And as you can see here, what he argued was that when a stereotype is deployed, it actually serves a functional purpose to relieve an inner anxiety on behalf of the person that's deploying that particular stereotype. He also is the first person to put forward the notion that stereotypes actually are the result of value spectrums, that people actually manage on an internal level their worldview, and that is intimately connected to stereotyping. Now his argument, which I think neuroscience starting in the 1990s, as our previous speaker mentioned, particularly with revolutions in fMRI, we now know a lot more. And I would actually argue that his solution was that we need to reorient the way that mainstream culture is socialized to understand the other. So I'm going to present a different view, but this was his primary focus. Another very interesting contribution that he had was a notion called the least effort principle. Now the least effort principle was an argument that he made about the way in which we categorize stimuli in our head. And he actually argued that when we categorize others, we do it in the same way that we would categorize an aversion to more mundane things. So for example, if I am not a fan of MSU, and I'm really glad that they got kicked out of the NCAA championship, that would actually, in terms of my brain and my chemistry, what's going on, that would actually be the same thing about how I feel towards the category of Muslims. Okay? So it's almost as if what's happening in the head is a very sort of arbitrary process that can actually be quite malleably replaced. Now, jumping forward about 30 years since Alport's great work, The Nature of Prejudice, we have a sort of sea change in the way that prejudice is understood. And this is what is called the affective turn. And there's a lot to be said about the affective turn, but for sake of time, the idea here is that we are emotional creatures. So the Great Enlightenment project that argued that we use rationalism and reason as the central feature of our moral decision-making, our ethical action in the world, is actually not accurate. Antonio Damasio, a great neuroscientist in this field, has been at the forefront of this movement, and he says that the faculty of emotion is central to moral decision-making because, after all, the deployment of a stereotype has to do with values, it has to do with morals, it has to do with balancing those sorts of things. Another very, very interesting example of this notion that emotion is at the center of our moral decision-making is the trolley experiment. Many of you psychologists will be familiar with this. They've actually taken, and in essence what the trolley experiment is you're on a train and you are given a choice between either saving the entire train, which is about to reach its destruction, but in so doing, you will actually have to sacrifice one individual, versus sort of jumping off and not doing anything. They would set people up to fMRIs upon giving them this proposition, and what they would find is that instead of the part of the brain that regulates reason, we're fully using the emotional part of our brain. And the vast majority of people actually chose to jump off and to not make that decision. So the idea here is that we are emotional beings, and that neuroscience actually proves this. As our previous speaker was saying, we now know really a nice picture of what happens in our minds when we make stereotypes. Another very fascinating and important point to mention here is the advances in mirror neurons. Now, mirror neurons are, to me, a fascinating discovery. I can't go into the great sort of background and detail of them, but what we learn from them is that our behavior is actually imitated in our mind. As the image shows, the monkey see, monkey do. What happens in the mind when the monkey himself is actually making a motion with a banana is the same thing that happens when he sees someone else making the same motion, right? So that this actually goes a long way, and there's actually a very great book on this called Pictures in Our Heads, which is an examination of how mirror neurons contributes to stereotype formation. Furthermore, this has led many philosophers, for example, one of my favorite French thinkers, Merleau-Ponty, to say that it is as if the other inhabits my body and I his. So, this is also why the Dalai Lama refers to mirror neurons as the proof, the scientific proof that we are compassionate beings. Because we now know that we actually have the capacity to not necessarily read minds, but to really have a sort of, and this is the key point, a pre-reflective understanding. So if I leave you with anything, the affective turn really shows that the majority of our mental processes are pre-reflective. And that's important because by pre-reflective, before using the faculty of reason, before analyzing something, the vast majority of our moral decisions are already made, right? So what does this lead to in terms of stereotypes? Now, let's think on a kind of more practical level about when a stereotype is deployed. There are two tendencies. One is what social psychologists call an egalitarian impulse. Now, you ever wonder why you have someone that grows up in, let's say, the South, during Jim Crow, and for some reason they have a set of experiences in their life that actually lead them to transcend the system of sort of bigotry, and they actually have a sort of a more humane understanding of African Americans. This is what they call an egalitarian impulse, and there's ways to measure that. So in doing some tests, and I'm going to share some case studies, you can actually get a sense of where somebody is at on that spectrum. So these two forces work to inhibit one another, right? That's key. And second is that the values themselves, and this is the key point, for those surveyed that have what's called high egalitarian impulses, the vast majority of those people self-regulate their stereotypes. In other words, they don't need the enforcement of someone else or the enforcement of a movie or a book or a television program, but they know they are good. And this is sort of the better angels of our nature, as JFK said. This is the vast majority of Americans. The vast majority of Americans are not what we saw in California with the Hate Comes to California viral YouTube video that some of you may have seen. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, where we had congressional representatives saying that I would love nothing more than to have my Marine son put these Muslims to an early paradise. That is not the majority of Americans. The majority of people, I would argue, have high egalitarian impulses and they self-regulate. Now, how are stereotypes changed? There's two frameworks. One is what they call intentional, and the second is called unintentional. Intentional would be things such as, I am intentionally trying to change the way that I see another person. Unintentional would be a change in environment. So this could be, we have a new television show. We have Little Mosque on the Prairie hits American broadcast. And soon that's a change in environment. People see Muslims in a completely different way. Now, I want to go through some case studies. Fascinating report now of people tested that wanted to intentionally change their stereotypes towards African Americans. One caveat here is that for most of these case studies, it's black on white. We don't have, and this is something that I would love for the social psychologists in the room to study, is let's study Arab and Muslim stereotypes more empirically. But we don't have much, but I think we can infer, because I would argue that on the psychological level, it still functions as an outgroup, and that's enough to still glean some general findings. Of those that wanted to intentionally reform their views of others, they had rebound effects. Like I mentioned before, another one in 1993 showed that egalitarian impulse, people of high values that really tended to, when surveyed said that they don't have stereotypes towards African Americans, several things happened. One was they had to actively and intentionally choose and self-regulate in a harsh way. They had to say, no, I'm not going to actually hold that view, even though they may have felt it. Another very interesting example was that when people were given distractions, so let's say we were presented with a deluge of negative images of Muslims, or in this case of African Americans, when distracted, the likeliness of them to actually harbor prejudice and so on was greatly diminished, which leads us to the central point, again, that stereotypes are not rooted in deep hostility. And I think one of the interesting things about the clash of civilizations is that it's a clash against our way of life, our culture, our religion, our very identities. But stereotype research in social psychology shows the opposite, that they're actually, nothing is process pure. Another great case study was at a university. Students were presented with a range of images, and again through fMRI research, this was at an all-white university. And what they did was they showed negative images of, at the beginning, negative images of African Americans, tested them with fMRI, amygdala firings were very high. Then, over a sustained period of time, they flooded the campus, they flooded the environment with positive images of blacks, and then flooded it with positive images of whites, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer. Then they tested them as a final point, and they saw significantly lower levels of fear towards African Americans writ large. So this again goes to show that perhaps a change in environment, the unintentional approach, is more powerful than the intentional approach. They did the same thing at another campus with more environmental shots. They would show a range of negative images at first of African Americans in ghettos, in poverty-stricken conditions, in stereotypical drive-bys, etc. And then they would show more positive images. And again, they saw the same positive movement, less fear, towards the entire category. So less fear even when shown a negative image. Now, let's talk about real-world application. A very interesting interview recently, Karl Rove, everybody knows who he is, recently said that he grew up in a household where the N-word was used in a normative sense, right? Around his dinner table, his father would say, you know, them N-words, I won't say the word, frequently. And then the interview person asked, so what changed that? And, well, let's see if we can find it. No. It was the Cosby Show. He said the Cosby Show is what made his father reform his general views towards African Americans. Why? Because for the first time, it was no longer PC to say that word. He couldn't. The culture had changed. African Americans had reached a certain point that it was impossible to even get away with it. So I think that's a real-world example of unintentional means of how stereotypes can change. So I wanted to go through a few things about sort of what we can do moving forward. And I think the first thing is that we need a change in environment. We absolutely have to have a sea change in the way that Muslims are represented in mainstream culture. Again, this goes back to my first point, which is that the primary focus should be towards reforming Muslims' cultural capital. Now, this obviously brings in a number of debates. Are we assimilating or are we integrating, right? And this is a separate discussion, but and hopefully we can have that at a later point. Second proposal I would make is for you psychologists, do more research on this stuff. Find out more empirical information about the way that people form stereotypes in the United States towards their Muslim neighbors. And I guarantee you the funding is available for this right now, if we find it. Third, since we know that people with egalitarian impulses, with the high values that tend to not stereotype, since we know how challenging it is for them to kind of go through the AA of stereotype reduction, interfaith dialogue, anti-stereotype reduction, workshops, trainings, etc., education helps too. What does that tell us? What does that tell us about how we can change intentional means? And finally, with our findings in Mirror Neurons, I would like to argue that we could take that data and make policy proposals for the change in the way that Muslims are represented on TV. So here are some models to keep in mind, and I'll kind of go through these, and again, I'll make this available to anyone that would like it. Now, wrapping up, I'd like to sort of put forward a very, very interesting hypothesis. This is by Robert Wright, who's a New York Times columnist. Now, again, my friends and I debate all the time. They're always like, no. Islamophobia should be challenged like the civil rights movement. You know, Muslims should protest. All my non-Muslim friends say, how come Muslims don't go to Capitol Hill and have a huge rally, 100,000 people, and say, we condemn terrorism in the name of Islam? But the Muslims, most of them say, you know, I'm not going to condemn something I have nothing to do with. But nonetheless, the civil rights approach does something, but here's another approach. How is it that now the majority of Americans are favorable towards gay marriage? Okay? Robert Wright argues that for the last 30, 40 years, homosexuals got to know their fellow non-homosexual Americans in the workplace, in the neighborhood, you know, as peers, outside of the construct of the big, spooky homosexual identity. Slowly but surely, that process worked in tandem with homosexuals themselves coming out of the closet, which then brought us to the point where we got to know them human to human, outside of the identity construct, to where we are today, where now it's actually PC, it's accepted for people to be gay openly, right? Now, I know that this might not be the ideal model to think of, maybe the most romantic model to think about, but I think it is the most accurate. And he refers to this as the bridging model. And then he uses a new book called American Grace by a sociologist whose name escapes me, where he argues that we cannot apply the bridging model to American Muslims because the population is too low. There's only 3 million Muslim Americans, 60% of Americans don't know a Muslim personally. How can we actually see if this could empirically work? And I think that the time will tell. I think that because we have the new Pew research showing that because of immigration and fertility rates of American Muslims, 3 million will change to 14 million, they predict, in the next 10 years, which is amazing to think about. Also amazing to think that this could mean that there will be more Muslims than Jews in America in the next 10 to 20 years. Now, talking about changes in environment, unintentional means. There was a project that was launched, the first of its kind in Hollywood, called Hollywood Health and Society, where it showed that the content we consume visually, movies, television, etc., have direct moral and ethical implications on our action. So if you watch Sex and the City and you see your favorite character get a breast examination, chances are the followers of that show will also get breast examinations. right? So we created a project in Hollywood modeled off of this called Muslims on Screen and Television. Now what Muslims on Screen and Television seeks to do is we recognize that fear sells. We know that already. That's obvious. Everybody knows that 24 is going to be more sexy than Little Mosque on the Prairie, right? But there is another story there, which is that there is a great cultural integration of Muslims that are happening, and frankly, using guilt and using reality of, look, you know, this population here, when you make a television show that demonizes them, they face it on the playground. You know, they deal with it from their own mental health blowbacks and rebounds. So trying to create a new bottom line, and also trying to create a factual approach. If you create a Muslim character and you're a television writer, think of how awful it would be if you use Google to come to that conclusion. I want to learn about the Sunni-Shia split, so I go to Wikipedia as opposed to a real Muslim. So that's what we're trying to do. So I would put forward that unintentional changes in the environment are the most significant. And I think what we really do need to see is a mainstream Muslim Cosby show. On the right is Little Mosque on the Prairie. On the left are the Cosbys. And we all know the Cosbys. And Bill Cosby's on board. He was interviewed recently. He's like, bring it on. I'm ready for a Muslim Cosby show. Now I just wanted to share some bridging model. A bridging model is, again, the intentional dialogue work that we can do together. For the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, I encourage you all to go to Ground Zero Dialogue. We put 8 of our films on Muslim culture online for you to share. Another one is My Faith, My Voice. For all Muslim Americans, I highly encourage you to go here. This is a way to sort of lower the fear and say, you know, look, America, I'm here too. I've grown up here. You have nothing to be scared of. I don't want to impose Sharia on you, etc., etc. This is a very great video called Injustice Cannot Defeat Injustice. This is done by the ulama, the scholars in the United States. It's about 20 minutes long. The New York Times covered it. Several 100,000 views on YouTube. This is what you point people towards when they say, how come Muslims don't condemn terrorism? Point them to this. And this is a clear condemnation, a theological condemnation. And finally, for you educators, we have 3 new websites. The most important is Islam and Civics, that I would highly recommend to anyone that teaches at high school or college level on these topics. And with that, I thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions, but it's been a real pleasure.